What does it mean to be a woman? This is just one of the questions at the heart of sound novel Umineko no Nakokoro ni, or Umineko When They Cry. Umineko, as I'll refer to it from here on out, was released episodically in 8 installments from 2007 to 2011 by Doujin or Indie Circle 7th Expansion, written by a man by the name of Ryukishi07. It's the second title in the When They Cry series, following predecessor Higurashi When They Cry. Umineko is not a direct sequel to Higurashi, but this analysis will include spoilers for both series. There will also be discussion of sexual violence, incest, and child abuse. Umineko is most simply described as a murder mystery series centering around the wealthy Ushinomiya family. The patriarch of the family, Kinzo, lives on his own private island, Rokkenjima, accompanied only by his eldest son's immediate family and a rotation of servants. Every October, the rest of Kinzo's children and their families gather on the island to discuss their respective financial endeavours. The story takes place around the 2-day conference of 1986, where Kinzo's suspected imminent passing and the distribution of his inheritance loom large. Shortly after the conference commences, a typhoon arrives, cutting communications and effectively sealing the island off from the outside world, following which people begin to die in impossible ways. The occult-style murders call to mind a legend that has always existed on Rokkenjima, that a witch by the name of Beatrice supposedly resides on the island. Rumour has it that it was Beatrice who lent Kinzo the vast amount of gold that allowed him to rebuild the Ushinomiya family while it was in financial ruins decades before. A portrait depicting Beatrice is displayed in the mansion, along with an epitaph containing a riddle which also seems to detail a sequence of ritualistic sacrifices. On the first day of the conference, the family receive a letter declaring that time has come for Beatrice to claim her interest for the lending of the gold. Everything of the family. The only way to halt the ominously described collection of interest is to solve the riddle. The story initially follows Battler, one of Kinzo's grandchildren who is returning to the family after a 6-year absence. The episodes each present us with a different possible version of events from the 2-day conference, but also meta-discussions as to whether the murders are occult or human in origin between another Battler and Beatrice, who observe the story as we do. There's so much to Umineko, as is evident from this video alone being the length that it is. It's not the last I'll make, so for today I want to talk about just 5 of the series' characters. Firstly, the 4 respective Ushinomiya women. Natsuhi, wife of Kraus, the eldest Ushinomiya sibling and mother of Jessica. Eva, second eldest Ushinomiya sibling, wife of Hideyoshi and mother of George. Kyrie, wife of Rudolph, third eldest Ushinomiya sibling, stepmother of Battler and mother of Enja, the only Ushinomiya missing from Rokkenjima in 1986 due to illness, and Rosa, the divorced youngest Ushinomiya sibling and mother of Maria. Finally, I'll talk about the culprit, Sayo Yasuda. Natsuhi appears at first blush the most married to her role within the Ushinomiya family, and able to draw self-esteem from her ability to perform this. As the story progresses, however, Natsuhi's inner conflict, while less overtly dramatic than some of her fellow characters, slowly surfaces. Before we get to any kind of backstory, in the flurry of character introductions that populate the first few hours of the story, we meet Natsuhi as the stern woman of the house, walking the tightrope of holding this position of authority and understanding the limits of said authority within a family governed by a strict hierarchy. This year's conference's true purpose quickly surfaces in the form of discussion of the distribution of Kinzo's inheritance, and as the conversation heats up, Eva doesn't hesitate to rebuff Natsuhi's unwanted interference, referring to her as a borrowed womb in front of the entire group. Natsuhi is expectedly scandalised, even more so when her husband fails to come to her aid, instead siding with his sister and condemning her for speaking out of turn. The scene ends with Natsuhi leaving the room in tears and the relatives continuing their conversation unfazed. This already tells us a great deal about how the Ushinomiya family functions. A bit of exposition then informs us further that Natsuhi had struggled to become pregnant early in her marriage to Kraus, as well as that in this period of time Eva gave birth first and to a boy. Where it would be customary for the woman to effectively leave the family at this point, Eva instead used this fact to gain Kinzo's favour, convincing him to allow her to stay rather than joining her husband's family registry, securing her metaphorical and literal seat at the table in all matters power and money related for good. In addition to the shame of not being able to readily fulfill her purpose of providing her husband with a child, this act by Eva only further increases the pressure on Natsuhi, by offering a potential alternative heir to the family to Kraus in the form of Eva's son George. This is the layered history behind this moment of tension between the two, and equally helps us to understand Eva's priority is to strongly assert herself and her family's place in the hierarchy. Later in the story we learn more about the beginning of Natsuhi's time in the Ushinomiya family. Natsuhi is described as being acquired by Kinzo as a suitable partner for his son from a rival upper-class family as a trophy, after driving said family into financial ruin, with Natsuhi's parents in no position to refuse the arrangement. Still a teen, Natsuhi describes feeling as though she were taken hostage, treated as nothing more than an object by and at the complete whims of the powerful men around her. When Natsuhi subsequently struggles to conceive, she is treated even more poorly by Kinzo, something she completely internalizes. She feels immense shame at her inability to fulfill her role. Of course, the fault is deemed to lie squarely with her, despite the fact that we now know 1 in 7 couples experience difficulty conceiving, and that this is just as often a result of the male partner's fertility. Growing up female, we're often told of our ability to bear children as fact, something our bodies are innately capable of. If anything, it's used as a threat. Here is the penalty, should you dare to be anything less than chaste. The When They Cry series is no stranger to social commentary, and it's made explicitly clear almost immediately that exploration of sexism will be central to this story. While Umineko began publishing in 2007, the year it opts for as its setting falls almost immediately prior to the so-called 1.57 shock of 1989, when Japan hit a record low in its fertility rate and concerns around an aging population exploded into the fore. As of 2024, the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report ranked Japan 118th out of 148 economies on the Global Gender Gap Index, a measure of educational, economical, political, and health standards for women across different countries. This is noteworthy as Japan is a developed country with an otherwise recognised high quality of life, signified by its membership of the G7. Still, to quote a report authored by Ipsos from 2022 about the impact of gender inequality on Japan's economy, unlike countries with similarly low rankings, gender inequality is not an obvious feature of everyday life in Japan. It does not manifest in overt, oppressive, or aggressive ways. In fact, most Japanese women would likely be unwilling to trade places with Japanese men, who carry their own burden of expectations. The report goes on to cite Japan's essentialist beliefs around gender and the innate qualities and roles of men and women, the fulfillment found in enacting these, and a societal inclination away from making a fuss about individual barriers faced as some of the reasons for this unchanging status quo. A qualitative study from 2022 exploring the impact of infertility treatment on Japanese women further states that the traditional beliefs that married couples should have children and the notion that couples are fully fledged when they have a child are deeply rooted in the country. The study also cites surveys from 2018 wherein around a quarter of married women answered that a couple is socially acceptable only after having a child, and 2015 wherein around a quarter of never married men and women respectively responded that a couple should have a child after marriage. To quote the paper, "In Japan, there is a socially accepted belief and expectation that one should have a child after marriage. Qualitative research has shown that some women undergoing infertility treatment internalize these values, and are obsessed with the idea that has been drilled into them that motherhood is a necessity, giving it topmost priority while considering their own existence as individuals as hardly important." Eventually, Natsuhi does become pregnant with Jessica and acclimatizes to her marriage, bringing us to the story's present day. Natsuhi's relationship with Jessica, now 18, is fairly strained as a result of her strict parenting and Jessica's rebellious nature. Natsuhi's nagging about Jessica's education and position as second in line to the Ushinomiya headship is purely bothersome to Jessica herself, who has little interest in either, but is likely born out of Natsuhi's anxiety regarding her failure to provide a male heir who would absolutely go on to succeed the family, as well as a want for Jessica to have the opportunities she did not. For Natsuhi, whose life's trajectory was largely determined by others, her daughter rising to the top of the family's power structure means security for Jessica, and perhaps even vindication for her. Natsuhi gets some more time in the spotlight through episode 1 as the last standing Ushiromiya parent, left to protect the children after the death of her husband, his siblings and their partners. This gives us a glimpse into Natsuhi's resilience, strength of character and integrity. This is then built on in episode 5, where Natsuhi really takes centre stage. In fact, Natsuhi is far more outspoken and opinionated than we might give her credit for when observing her playing the role of the subservient wife. She continually attempts to steer Kraus with regards to his often poor business decisions, though Kraus ultimately trusts his male business partners more than Natsuhi for advice, and has too much pride to recognise his failings. Episode 5 is also where we learn that, as is suspected by the siblings, Kinzo actually passes away in 1985, and Kraus, Natsuhi, a handful of the servants and family physician Nanjo conspire to keep this from them. The decision is made due to Kraus having embezzled Kinzo's money to fund unstable business ventures, resulting in him being in a position of considerable debt at the time of Kinzo's passing, and the fear that this embezzlement will be exposed when time comes to dish out Kinzo's assets. Being that Kinzo is already extremely reclusive and disagreeable towards his children, it's agreed that it will be possible to give the illusion that he's still alive for a further year, until Kraus can recoup his losses. The illusion of Kinzo continuing to live is largely managed by Natsuhi, and we see a series of fantastical sequences wherein Natsuhi envisions herself actually speaking to Kinzo's ghost as she goes about this task. Natsuhi utilises these conversations with Kinzo to give voice to her innermost feelings, those she doesn't feel she has the right to express, having Kinzo frequently berate Kraus and wish he had somebody like Natsuhi to succeed him. These thoughts might not only feel blasphemous to Natsuhi, but simply beyond what she can consciously conceive of from within the strict set of norms that provide the structure for her world. Even while recognising her own capabilities, she can't begin to dream of recognition for herself. This simply hasn't ever been available to her. She's left to fantasise via Kinzo about what might have been had she been born male. Natsuhi's character comes to be defined in the first act of episode 5 by this melancholic feeling that there is more, but an unwillingness to delve too deeply into the idea, because nothing can come of it but greater sadness and unfulfillment. While constructing the Kinzo ruse, Natsuhi equally imagines the witch Beatrice helping her execute this magical deception, with Beatrice ultimately becoming a sort of imaginary friend. As Beatrice describes the feeling of being confined to the island as akin to being a bird in a cage, living a comfortable but limited life with no prospect of more, Natsuhi relates to this, and acknowledges her own loneliness. What becomes apparent in episode 5 is that Natsuhi is under no illusions about her circumstances, but makes an active choice to view them as positively as she can. Natsuhi opts to believe in a truth that is salvation for her, also as a means of taking back power. She had no choice but to marry Kraus, or have children, or be a housewife or an Ushiromiya, but she can choose to find a kind of happiness within this reality. She is strongly led by her set of values, chief among these that of serving the family and its legacy without fail. Defining what matters to her is another way of taking back power and a sense of purpose, even if this comprises defending the very institution that took so much from her. This is also what makes the end of episode 5's main story so brutal, another where Natsuhi survives into the late stages and is framed as the killer of her own family. As is typical for When They Cry characters, Natsuhi is far from sinless. When she initially fails to provide the family with an heir, Kinzo brings her a baby to raise as her own, its origins a mystery. Natsuhi is so scandalised by this that, while one day walking the island with the baby and a servant, in a moment of extreme emotion, she pushes the servant carrying the baby off a cliff, killing both, at least as far as she's aware. The incident is settled quietly, rewritten as an accident, and life continues as though the whole thing had never happened, though Natsuhi carries the repressed guilt with her, even suffering chronic headaches. Throughout the episode, Natsuhi is threatened by calls from somebody posing as the man from 19 years ago, the baby Natsuhi pushed off the cliff back for revenge. Jessica is killed, and Natsuhi is told that her husband has been taken hostage, and that she must follow the instructions she's given to protect him. By the end of episode 5, it becomes apparent that Natsuhi has been set up to look like the culprit, and she's formally accused. In the episode, we're introduced to Erika Furudo, a passerby turned lay detective who shelters in the mansion following a boat accident. Erika uses the layers of deceit Natsuhi has been tangled in to construct a theory that she is an adulterer who has been sleeping with her husband's elderly father in a plot to take control of the family. An allegation carefully constructed to tar Natsuhi's character in the way most offensive to her. The goal is to prompt her to reveal the now evident cover-up of Kinzo's death, and sacrifice Kraus's honour for her own sake, which she refuses to do. Paradoxically, in being so dedicated to her family and her role, she is painted as entirely the opposite, somebody who schemed to take over the Ushiromiya name and fortune, and ultimately massacred her relatives and even killed her own daughter to this end. Erika further posits that Natsuhi never loved her husband, and as the ultimate violation, reads her diaries to her relatives, citing these as evidence. In the diaries alone, Natsuhi shares her honest feelings, the struggles of being forced to marry and bear children for a man she never wanted to be with, and of her cold treatment within the family. Natsuhi argues that these hardships were real, but that she also grew to genuinely love Kraus, and sealed the diaries away, no longer having any use for them. Erika argues that there is no evidence of this love recorded, only unhappiness. Episode 5 is palpably stressful to read as you watch Natsuhi walk an impossible tightrope. In being forced to maintain her husband's deception in his absence with no allies while under constant scrutiny and suspicion, denied even the space to grieve her daughter's death, we see a literal illustration of the emotional catch-22 Natsuhi lives out day to day. There is no space for her true thoughts or emotions. In a moment of reprieve, Natsuhi finds herself alone with Ava's husband Hideyoshi, and feels safest here, in the company of a fellow outsider. Despite all her sacrifices, this is still how she is regarded. A voice with no weight or power, almost entirely excluded when time comes for the family to close ranks. Before all of this, when Kraus suggests in the worst case he and Natsuhi get a divorce, and he shoulder the burden of his catastrophic financial decisions, Natsuhi is distraught. Why can't he see, after all she's suffered to get here, all she wants is his love, the only reward she might be granted, the only love she was ever given the option of receiving. Running away was never a choice for her. Even as the discussion of Natsuhi's culpability is elevated to the meta-world, and another of the witches, Bern Castell, utilises the Red Truth, a narrative device promising absolute impartiality, to tell Natsuhi that Kinzo never truly respected or loved her, she refuses to let him be incriminated. Scapegoat though she may be, if she abandons her values now, she has nothing left at all. Of the 4 Ushiromiya women, Natsuhi places the most importance in the act of exemplifying her role, if only because this is all she has ever known. Even so, as a human being, she feels the deep unfairness of her circumstances, the ways in which they constrain her. As she grapples with this contradiction, she settles on a form of quiet resistance, seeking contentment. While Natsuhi doesn't outwardly rebel against the norms that have dictated her life, she does everything she can to build a better one for her daughter. She doesn't bow down to the criticism and abuse she receives. The unhappiness recorded in her diaries is her reality, as are the moments where we see her genuine love for her husband and daughter, and dedication to her family. These truths do not invalidate one another. It's common in fiction to see characters who boldly challenge outdated norms, power structures and forms of discrimination, or else characters who submit entirely to them and become victims. Natsuhi sits in the middle of this spectrum and is more provocative for it. Somebody who recognises the injustice of her reality, as well as the simple truth that she is far likelier to find a form of peace from within it than by rejecting it and being rejected by all she knows in turn. She finds the worth in the roles she has played and the life she has lived, even if nobody else does. Still, her peace is a fragile one, built on a foundation of denial. She and the audience alike are ultimately reminded, that you cannot embrace the system in this way without becoming a conduit for its violence. It's no surprise that Eva often comes to blows with Natsuhi throughout Umineko. Our introduction to Eva in episode 1 asserts her as a strong character, sarcastic if not spiteful, never afraid to go on the offensive, and unwavering in her pursuit of her goals. She is still petitioning for her son to succeed the family, but is at least determined to secure the wealth she sees as rightfully hers at any cost. Even coercing Kraus is her idea. Simply put, Eva is a rebel. Episode 3 opens with Hideyoshi discussing Eva with Rudolph, noting that Eva isn't so harsh as she appears, but that when she returns to Dokkenjima, she changes. Rudolph responds that he's not surprised that the upcoming battle over the inheritance is making Eva tense, noting her strained relationship with Kraus. Ava's particular disdain towards Kraus and general hard exterior is recontextualized with insight into her childhood. Kraus has a history of being openly sexist towards Eva and is entitled from a young age. Eva had always aspired to take over the family, but the idea had never been so much as entertained purely on the basis of her sex. Despite being more skilled and capable than her brother, Kraus receives more recognition and acknowledgement from their father simply by virtue of his being the eldest son, being effectively guaranteed the headship irrespective of any effort he does or doesn't put forth. Kraus delights in this privilege, and calls Eva a failure of a woman by comparison, unable to accept her natural station, and actively lacking in all the qualities she should aspire to and espouse. Ava's ultimate path is clear: to leave the family to marry and support a suitable husband, much like we see Natsuhi do. On the one hand, Eva has her hopes for herself, and on the other, the path of least resistance, to fulfill her father's expectations of her and earn his approval. These clearly contradictory concepts create a metaphorical split in Ava's identity. She is torn between her duty to herself and her duty to her family, which are directly opposed. As she reminisces about her childhood, we are introduced to Ava's inner witch, the crystallization of her desires as a child to become the head of the family, urging her not to give up on this dream. We see the now adult Ava reasoning with the witch, explaining that her decisions to marry Hideyoshi and have George were the logical and realistic compromise to allow her to achieve something close to that dream. The witch berates Ava for ruining George's life by pushing her own unfulfilled hopes onto him, and even reproducing the dynamic between herself and Kraus, now between Jessica and George. Moreover, the witch reminds Ava there is no room for compromise if she is to honour what she truly wanted for herself. Ava wakes up, still on the boat to Dokkenjima and shaken. She asks Hideyoshi if he and George hate her, if, in as many words, the witch is right about her being a bad mother, only trying to satisfy herself. Hideyoshi comforts her, and we see that this is clearly an ongoing fear. After the family receive the letter on the first day of the conference, Ava goes on to solve the riddle and find Beatrice's gold, the first time either of these things is shown as happening in the story. The witch is depicted in the metaworld as succeeding Beatrice, and taking on the title of Ava Beatrice. After this, the murders begin in earnest, with Ava Beatrice depicted as the perpetrator. Ava's character can be partially conceptualized through Freud's id, ego, and superego, with Ava Beatrice representing the id, the unconscious, instinct-driven and pleasure-seeking part of the mind, concerned only with immediate gratification. This is represented in Ava Beatrice's murders, which are a perverse mix of childlike in conception and incredibly sadistic in execution. The superego meanwhile represents moral conscience, societal and parental standards, and a striving for ideal behaviour. The ego is the rational mediator that balances the id's impulses with real-world constraints. Throughout episode 3, this struggle is represented by Ava's conflict with Ava Beatrice over her selfish, destructive actions. When Ava Beatrice ultimately kills Hideyoshi, citing him as secondary to Ava's true goal, a distraught Ava berates her. A child like her can't appreciate what Hideyoshi has given her, nor that her becoming a wife and a mother isn't a betrayal of the self. Ava's dialogue with Eva Beatrice calls to mind Natsuhi's with Kinzo and Beatrice, each stages upon which unconscious desires are made evident. Another comparison is drawn between the characters by their experiencing headaches linked with their repression, and, in Ava's case, nightmares. The fact that Ava's unconscious mind is illustrated using herself as a child is appropriate. She can't move past the lack of recognition and love from her father, conditional on her ability to fulfill her role, and the fact that her own wants were at odds with this. This is also reflected in her decision to stay on the Ushiromiya family registry. All at once a rejection of the expectation to marry out, and symbolic of her inability to move past this conflict, mature and emotionally liberate herself from her father, brother, and everything the Ushiromiya family represents for her. In attempting to rebel and conform all at once, Eva cannot truly commit to either, nor achieve the closure a single choice might grant her, however bittersweet. While episode 3 is just one possibility for what truly happened on Rokkenjima in 1986, episode 4 presents us with some of the facts, amongst them that Eva was the lone survivor to return from the conference, and that she was left to care for Rudolph and Kyrie's child, and Battler's younger half-sister Enja. The relationship ultimately develops into one of abuse and mutual hatred, unresolved until Ava's death in 1998. When we first meet Eva, she's one of the least sympathetic characters in Umineko, but this is ultimately inverted. Episode 7 finally shows us a probable version of the truth of what happened on Rokkenjima, a scenario in which the siblings and their partners collaborate to discover the gold, as well as that there are tons of explosives stored beneath the island from its time as a military base during the war. The adults end up in a disagreement about how the gold will be divided, culminating in a scuffle during which Eva accidentally shoots and kills Natsuhi. Eva and Hideyoshi completely panic, and in the midst of the confusion, Kyrie takes the initiative and begins to kill the others off one by one. Unbeknownst to her, one shot misses. When Eva eventually comes to in a room full of corpses, she immediately goes to search for George. She instead finds Rudolph and another body. After killing her brother to avenge her son, Eva and Kyrie finally face off. As a distraught Eva berates Kyrie, she calmly tells Eva that she would have done the same given a little more time, if it meant having the money to herself. Eva denies this, but once again doubts herself. Eva tries to appeal to Kyrie as a fellow mother, asking her how she can take a life. Kyrie states that children are nothing more than a way to tether your husband, and that she feels nothing for Enja now that Rudolph is dead. Eva is appalled by this, and when Kyrie suggests that she now feel equally free without George, Eva finally kills her, vowing to rewrite all the deaths as an accident using the explosives, obscuring the truth from Enja and the world. This recontextualizes Ava's cruel treatment of Enja with the understanding that it was Enja's parents who took Ava's loved ones from her. When she first returns from Rokkenjima, Ava keeps her resolution, swallowing the truth, and tries to be kind to Enja in the midst of her grief, but is met not only with rejection from the 6-year-old, but the eventual widespread belief that she is the culprit. Like Natsuhi before her, Ava records the truth in her diary alone, and guards it for the duration of her life. Following her death and Enja's acquisition of the diary, the knowledge it contains drives her to attempt suicide. Ava's arc ends in episode 8, as Enja finally comes to understand her true intentions. Enja gains some closure through interactions with Ava within the meta world, and Ava Beatrice is equally recontextualized as a protective force, somebody who takes on the mantle of killer with the purpose of shielding Enja from the harsh truth. Ava's story is tragic. She achieves her goal of succession, but at an immense cost. She dies alone and misunderstood, but fulfills her newfound purpose of protecting Enja, ultimately becoming the object of Enja's hatred, another scapegoat. In the scene with Kyrie, Eva proves something necessary to herself. After having lost her handle on her identity in the tug-of-war between inner hopes and outward expectations, doubting her right to the love of her husband and son, her motives for her actions, and the cruelty she could and has shown in pursuit of her goals, here we see the humanity in Eva win out. She finds purpose in becoming Enja's protector, if only from the rot at the heart of the family and world that poisoned her. She agrees to play a different kind of role. If her part is that of the villain, so be it. She knows that in time Enja will face the truth, and by leaving her the key, also allows herself to be known and judged. Where deceit has created so much of the inheritance of trauma within the family, despite the pain she too comes to cause Enja, this act of selflessness on Eva's part is her legacy, a purification. Continuing the trend, our first impression of Rosa is vastly different from the one we gain over the course of the story. When introduced as the youngest of the Ushiromiya siblings, Rosa appears mild-mannered and kind. This is quickly turned on its head when, not long after the family arrive on Rokkenjima, Rosa loses her temper at her daughter Maria and begins to hit her in front of the other cousins. Maria is looking for a particular wilting rose she had decided to nurse in the mansion's garden and can't find it. Maria acts younger than her 9 years and tends towards what Rosa sees as tantrums. Actually, Maria appears likely to be autistic. Rosa sees it as her role to discipline Maria into maturity. At least, this is how she justifies her actions to herself and others. Just in this scene we see her retreat, not trusting herself not to become even more violent with her crying daughter. Rosa leaves Maria in the garden, ordering her to stay there if that's what she wants, and falls asleep in the mansion. When she later wakes up to pouring rain, she realises Maria is still outside, and appears overcome with a wave of guilt, rushing out to find her daughter and apologising. We come to learn that this is typical of Rosa, enough so that Maria sees these episodes of extreme anger and violence from her as periods of possession by a bad witch, now a recurrent motif. When we see a similar scene at the start of episode 2, this time on public transport, we can surmise that Rosa is primarily concerned with others' perception of her. When Maria becomes upset after another bout of abuse from her mother, it's only the reactions of passengers around them that cause Rosa to check her behaviour. By this point we've learned that Rosa, who is considerably younger than her siblings, spent her childhood enduring harsh bullying from all of them, alongside strict and sometimes punitive parenting. Isolated by her age and the fact that she lives on Rokkenjima, she also goes on to develop a complex about her lack of ability compared to Kraus, Eva and Rudolph. In addition to her broadly unhappy childhood, Rosa experiences a defining trauma, the death of Kuadorian Beatrice. One day, when Rosa is still in middle school, she runs into the forest surrounding the mansion following an argument with her mother about her grades, and eventually uncovers the rumoured but never before seen secret second mansion Kuadorian, where Kinzo supposedly hides his mistress. Rosa finds a girl there calling herself Beatrice, one who the portrait in the mansion later seems to depict exactly. Still, this Beatrice doesn't quite live up to the awe-inspiring legend of the witch. Beatrice is delighted to meet Rosa, appearing to have been living in isolation for some time. She's childlike in demeanour and lacks knowledge of the outside world despite being older than Rosa, so Rosa agrees to accompany her beyond the mansion grounds through the hole in the fence she'd found. As the two become lost and go out to the perimeter of the island to find their way, however, Beatrice falls from the cliff face and to her evident death. A guilt-stricken Rosa runs home, confessing to head servant Genji that night, but otherwise never speaking or hearing of the young Beatrice again. Rosa grows up repressing her guilt and trauma until the entire ordeal becomes nothing more than a nightmare. though this also achieves the result of it forever feeling as though retribution might arrive at any moment, most especially from the father Rosa already fears so much. There are powerful echoes of the incident with Natsuhi and the baby. The burden of the secret stays with Rosa, driving a wedge into her familial relationships. As an adult, Rosa starts a fashion brand and experiences moderate success, but after meeting Maria's father and becoming pregnant, the man disappears with Rosa's money, leaving her to raise Maria alone. Seen as dim-witted and manipulable by her elder siblings, Rosa largely flies under their radar. The disparity between her seemingly agreeable outward appearance and harsh treatment of Maria already indicates something more complex, and this is expanded on in episode 2 when Rosa is the only Ushiromiya adult to survive the first round of killings. Rosa takes on an aggressive stance as the last remaining parent and shows herself as capable of an almost animalistic ferocity, particularly in protecting Maria. She has no true trust in and an ability to sacrifice anybody who poses a threat to the two, including her own family. In episode 3, Rosa solves the riddle immediately after Ava, and the two cross paths on their ways to and from the gold. Here it occurs to Ava for the first time that the two may be matched in both intellect and cunning. It's never clear from this point on if one can trust the other, and while Ava Beatrice ultimately kills Rosa, we can believe that things may have transpired differently had Rosa been given the opportunity for them to. In episode 4 we get further insight into Rosa's life off Rokkenjima. She regularly neglects Maria, leaving her at home alone to go away with her boyfriend while telling Maria that she's at work. This continues to the point where Rosa receives a visit from a child welfare officer, and when she asks how the woman even knows Maria has been left alone, it's explained that Maria is often seen around the neighbourhood at night with a distinctive toy animal. The animal is Sakutaro, a toy Rosa gifts Maria on her birthday, who Maria treats as her best friend. As part of her disapproval of Maria's childlike traits, Rosa forbids her from leaving the house with Sakutaro and her other toys, and in light of this rule having been broken, tears Sakutaro apart in front of Maria. This is nothing short of traumatic for Maria, particularly seeing as she believes Sakutaro was handmade by Rosa just for her. We next see a sequence within the meta world where Maria's witch persona punishes Rosa for her actions. As with so much of Umineko, it's questionable how much, if at all, this sequence represents Rosa's true feelings versus simply Maria's interpretation of them. Still, in this scene, Rosa draws a parallel between her treatment as a child, down to her siblings destroying her toys in service of her maturation, and how she raises Maria. She wasn't given the opportunity to be upset. That repression became her maturation into an adult. Here we also see a more explicit discussion of Rosa's relationship to motherhood. Rosa, or this vision of her, affirms Maria's greatest fear, that she herself has tried to manage for so long, that Rosa regrets giving birth to her. Maria was useful to Rosa when she had a role to play in the formation of the family unit, a particular kind of fantasy, but after being abandoned by Maria's father, she's only a reminder of something Rosa wants to forget. More broadly, Rosa sees Maria as a shackle to the role of motherhood and the selflessness it demands. She further notes how easily men can move between women, but how single mothers are held back by the responsibility they hold and the stigma of their label. Single mothers did and still do in fact face significant marginalisation and disadvantage in Japan. Rosa's desire for romantic and sexual intimacy and her role as a mother are, in her eyes, in direct opposition to one another. For Rosa, Maria is a means of securing her partner, securing his love, in turn a replacement for something she didn't receive in childhood. Maria's father instead created in Rosa an apparent fear of abandonment, which she projects onto the various men she sees following this. Maria provides an excuse for their perceived rejection of her. These men don't want her because she already has a child with another man. This allows her to avoid reflecting on either her own conduct or her choice in partners. The one that we do see is already married. And yet, when Rosa experiences this rejection, she returns to Maria. In spite of it all, the only love and validation she can absolutely rely on. Notably, unlike Ava, and even to an extent Natsuhi, Rosa doesn't have a character arc in Umineko. She doesn't change. An argument can be made that Rosa is simply a link in the chain of suffering within the Ushiromiya family, somebody who passes on the treatment she received. But we see through Natsuhi and Ava's acknowledgements of their failings that this cannot be an excuse. Her character can equally be seen as a representation of one of society's greatest myths, that women hold an innate and naturally occurring aptitude for motherhood, rather than it simply being another role they must grow into, often messily, and may reject entirely. It's a complex picture. Rosa's reflections on the double standards placed upon and the double bind women exist within aren't wrong, but by leaning on them, she submits to them, never taking ownership over her destiny, nor responsibility for the harm she perpetuates. In her search for autonomy, she instead sacrifices it. Of all the women, Kyrie's introduction is surprisingly representative, though it isn't apparent how much so for some time. From her first lines, Kyrie is primarily concerned with her husband, Rudolph. Other than this, however, the early part of the story portrays her as the friendly and more down-to-earth stepmother to Battler, a seeming oasis of rationality and calm in the midst of the conflict, not entirely dissimilar to how Rosa first appears. Kyrie blends into the background to an extent across the first 2 episodes, but there is one brief but interesting exchange between her and Rosa in episode 2. While the family are catching up after arriving on Dokkenjima and exchanging pleasantries, Kyrie comments on how grown up Maria has become. Rosa rebuts this and any praise of her as a mother. Rosa notes that children unfortunately can't choose their parents, and Kyrie's response is to say that parents also can't choose their children. Episode 3 is the first which sees Kyrie survive past the first round of murders, and gives us a bit of further insight into her character. In the scene in question, which utilises the story's fantasy elements, Kyrie is facing off with Leviathan, one of Beatrice's 7 servants who represent the 7 sins. Leviathan represents and draws her power from the sin of envy. Kyrie ultimately wins the battle, explaining that her envy is incomparable to anybody else's, after losing Rudolph to another woman for 18 years. The context is that Kyrie becomes romantically involved with Rudolph while working at his company, eventually becoming his business partner, though Rudolph is already engaged to another woman, Asumu. Asumu and Kyrie both fall pregnant at the same time, and Kyrie hopes that this may be her foothold to cause Rudolph to break off the engagement and choose her. The two are due to deliver on the same day in the same hospital, but Kyrie experiences a stillbirth while Asumu gives birth to Battler. It's only in the story's present day that Asumu has recently passed away, and Kyrie has been able to marry Rudolph. After 18 years of waiting, resentment festering, and obsession building. This scene tells us a few interesting things. First of all, it's immediately apparent that Kyrie loathes Asumu. Kyrie doesn't blame Rudolph for his infidelity, but rather directs this blame towards his partner. She talks about Asumu using her body to lure Rudolph and her trapping him in a marriage, despite these being her same tactics. She reasons that if she has a child with him, Rudolph will choose her. All of this appears at odds with the level of intelligence and non-emotional impartiality we see Kyrie demonstrate up to this point. She seems more than capable of understanding that the affair says far more about Rudolph than anybody else, but appears to disregard this reality. She takes the accumulated bitterness out not on Rudolph, but on these other women, her competition. It becomes increasingly apparent throughout Umineko that Kyrie is extremely sharp and inclined towards suspicion of others. In episode 3, she comes to suspect Ava and Hideyoshi of the murders early on, makes key observations regarding the riddle in the epitaph, and in discussions regarding the inheritance, shows herself as able to calmly exert pressure on and even manipulate and threaten Kraus. At one point, Rudolph notes that Kyrie can at times reject empathy entirely, and think in a purely logical manner, in a way that scares even him. Sure enough, in episode 6, Kyrie reveals to Jessica that she reached a point where she intended to kill Asumu, so that she could finally be with Rudolph, before Asumu naturally passed away from illness. Kyrie is staunchly individualistic, even antisocial. It's her happiness or somebody else's. She sits directly opposed to Natsuhi in terms of values, and apart from the other three women in how little others' suffering appears to affect her. She grows up within the Sumadera clan, a powerful traditional family from Kyoto with strong ties to the underworld very akin to the Sonozakis in Higurashi. She leaves the family behind completely, including her younger sister Kasumi, who takes on the burden of succeeding the family. This results in an arranged marriage that forces Kasumi to give up on her actual relationship, something she harbours a deep resentment towards Kyrie for the rest of her life. Kyrie, however, feels no sense of duty to her sister or family at all. Still, what also becomes increasingly apparent about Kyrie throughout Umineko is that, despite her cool exterior and independence, she is in fact extremely insecure, jealous and anxious within her relationship with Rudolph. This eats into and twists her personality completely. The fact that Kyrie's relationship with Rudolph is itself built on infidelity leaves her hypervigilant to potential threats. This manifests itself as a frightening malice. For one example, Rudolph at times makes passing comments about Jessica's attractiveness. Jessica is Rudolph's niece and a teenager, and yet, in episode 7, when Kyrie kills Jessica, she also takes the time to beat her corpse's face beyond recognition. Kyrie's obsession with Rudolph controls how she interacts with everybody, even Enja and Battler. Kyrie projects her disdain for Asumu onto Battler, while pretending to care about him because it's what Rudolph wants. The image of the good mother is just one tool in her arsenal. For Kyrie, pregnancy is first and foremost a way of securing Rudolph, very much like Rosa viewed her pregnancy with Maria. In episode 8, we finally learn a critical truth, that Kyrie is Battler's mother as well as Enja's. The day Kyrie and Asumu were giving birth, Asumu's baby was the stillbirth, while Kyrie gave birth to Battler. Rudolph took the opportunity to save himself from needing to support two households, one with his wife, the other with his mistress and child, and consolidate. While Kyrie is outwardly kind to Battler, Rudolph can sense that Kyrie regards him coldly due to his status as Asumu's son, and reaches a point where he decides to tell Kyrie the truth. This revelation has an immense impact on Kyrie. Not only does she learn that she's been lied to the end of being deprived of a real relationship with her son for 18 years, she learns that Rudolph does this to her for entirely selfish reasons. It's one of the single most callous acts we see in the entire story. Moreover, the belief that sustained Kyrie for those 18 years, that if she had only been able to bear a child, she would have received the love she so desperately wanted from Rudolph, the belief that ate at her to the point where she was willing to take Asumu's life, is revealed to have been unfounded all along. Rudolph never chose her, not even when she had his child and Asumu did not until Asumu died. Kyrie plays the game perfectly, dedicates herself to doing so. She has to believe that it's the single element out of her control that destroys her chances of success, as a matter of self-preservation. Here she learns that nothing she did was ever going to be enough. Kyrie gives up everything for Rudolph, ultimately even her humanity. And then, in episode 7, she finds out that he's dead. Here, Kyrie loses the thing she had drawn everything about her life and self in relation to. She attributes her fulfillment to her relationship with Rudolph, and commits atrocities by his side, or is willing to be with him. She cannibalizes herself for him. Ava frees her, but it's a freedom she doesn't know how to exist within. Of all the women, despite appearing the most independent from the structures that govern them, Kyrie may be the most lost. A popular theory about the scene in episode 7 is that much of what Kyrie says to Ava in her final moments is to goad Ava to the point where she feels a duty to Enja out of spite towards Kyrie, perhaps obscures the truth entirely to protect Enja from it. I'm willing to believe it. The foresight, emotional intelligence, cunning and level of performance this would demand is exactly what we should have come to expect from Kyrie by this point. Perhaps our greatest indication of how Kyrie truly feels towards her children comes in episode 4, where she uses the last moments of her life to tell Battler that she is sorry for how she's treated him. In the end, Kyrie secures what she likely wanted, a mother who will give Enja the love she could not, a love that isn't perverted by and lost amidst other goals. Where for the other women we can understand part of their internal worlds, values, motivations and influences, and how these inform their relationships to their roles and themselves in turn, I initially found Kyrie the hardest to pass. She can feel like a caricature, because she is. She's a performer, always exerting an active effort to sustain her status quo, always concealing this effort, always judging how much of herself she can honestly share without losing the upper hand. She rarely, if ever, lets the facade slip, least of all with Rudolph himself. Her relationship with Rudolph begins while she's in her early 20s, likely before she ever truly learns who she would or could be without him. He teaches her that love and acceptance are strictly conditional, and she takes on the challenge. She crafts a persona, makes herself whatever it will take to stand out. If women are gentle, nurturing and docile, she will be cold, intellectual, strong-willed. She dedicates herself single-mindedly to her goal, believing that when she reaches it, she will find some kind of peace. Even her relationship to motherhood is not her own. Kyrie exists for Rudolph, so that when time comes to retire the role, there's nothing to return to. The mask only conceals an abyss. Finally, Sayo Yasuda. In episode 1 of Umineko, we are introduced to Shannon and Kanon, two servants of the Yoshiromiya family. Shannon is a kind-hearted, gentle and demure girl, while Kanon is a younger, more reserved and serious boy. We spend more time with Shannon. She's worked on the island for longer, and her existing relationships with the cousins are apparent. Shannon is also revealed to have a romantic relationship with George, which culminates in a proposal from him on the evening of the guest's arrival. Episode 2 gives us the origin of Shannon and George's relationship. Shannon is first depicted as beginning to notice her feelings for George when he defends her from criticism from the rest of the family during one visit to the island, but she condemns herself for these emotions. Ava does the same, highlighting her status as a servant. Beatrice later appears to Shannon and Kanon for the first time, and offers to sponsor Shannon's love with her magic. Shannon grapples with the idea that she is undeserving of love, referring to herself as furniture. She is torn between her want to indulge her feelings and the comfort of not challenging the status quo. Still, her feelings continue to grow, and she ultimately appeals to Beatrice for support, with Shannon and George subsequently beginning to date. Kanon equally begins to develop a relationship with Jessica, but where Shannon ultimately appears to embrace her right and want to love, Kanon rejects this when the opportunity of a relationship with Jessica presents itself, not wanting to go through what he sees as the inevitable eventual heartbreak, not wanting to hope. It's powerful to see these two opposing positions, the defiant belief in a future against the odds, and the complete rejection of one before it's begun. When we reach this episode's conference, Beatrice arrives at the mansion as a guest, and describes her plans to sacrifice George and Shannon as part of the epitaph ritual to Kanon. He accuses her of only endorsing the two's relationship to enjoy seeing them torn apart, which Beatrice affirms. Beatrice offers to spare Shannon only if she rejects George's proposal, which Kanon begs her to do, but Shannon refuses this proposition, accepting the ring without hesitation when it's offered to her. Later in the episode, Beatrice first kills Kanon and Jessica, then Shannon and George. Beatrice taunts the couples, reminding them that love is nothing more than lust disguised. but she only comes across as bitter and envious, particularly when Kanon and Shannon aren't fazed by this. Shannon instead tells Beatrice that she feels sorry for her. This dynamic continues through episode 3, though Beatrice later softens after she receives criticism from Battler in the meta world, and her true emotions begin to show through. By episode 4, Beatrice's hostile facade has broken down, and her own loneliness and want to be understood have become evident. This is also where she tells Battler that he is in some way responsible for the tragedies that take place on the island. In episode 5, Meta-World Battler finally comes to understand what actually took place on Rokkenjima, and who Beatrice is, but Beatrice herself has suffered a kind of spiritual death from her loss of hope that this will ever come to pass. Battler inherits the Game Master responsibilities from her, as somebody who now knows the truth of the story, and writes a tale that demonstrates this, ultimately reviving Beatrice. The two acknowledge their love for one another. Within the story's fantasy plane, the revived Beatrice, Shannon and Kanon take part in a trial to determine which will be able to realise their relationship, as only one can be granted this. If you haven't read Umineko, I've no doubt this is becoming increasingly hard to follow. It's not much less opaque for readers themselves by this stage, that is, if they haven't themselves reached the truth of the story. This is finally revealed to us in episode 7, which functions as a kind of meta post-mortem. In the episode, Beatrice's funeral is taking place, and a detective by the name of Willard H. Wright, or Will, is enlisted by Berncastel to discover who killed her. He finds a companion in Leon Ushiromiya, Kraus and Natsuhi's child and Jessica's elder sibling. Somebody Will is puzzled to see, seeing as Leon has never appeared in any story until this point. Incidentally, Leon's gender is a mystery. They present androgynously, and brush off questions about it, though they are recognised as the heir to the family. Eventually, Will realises that Leon killed Beatrice, that Leon is Beatrice, or who she would have become under different circumstances. The Ushiromiya's servants are all recruited from an orphanage the family sponsors, Fukui House. The family take on young people from the home and give them the opportunity to work on Rokkenjima to provide them with valuable experience and a professional recommendation for when they enter adult life. Sayo Yasuda is one such servant. Sayo is asked to come and work for the family at just 6 years of age, and struggles to physically and emotionally keep up with the demands of the role. This leads to her being mocked rather than supported by her peers. This isn't helped by the fact that Sayo is perceived to experience favouritism from the head servants, contributing to rumours that she could be an illegitimate child of the family. Where other servants are primarily housekeepers, Sayo also acts as a companion for the similarly aged Jessica. As Sayo begins to work for the family, we see feelings of inadequacy come to the fore. Sayo doesn't have a strong sense of self, and rather than fighting the bullying from the other servants, or standing up for herself, she internalises the ostracisation, becoming isolated. In addition to being rejected by her peers, Sayo is reminded that she is not to see Jessica as a friend, and primarily finds companionship in her relationships with the much older Genji and Kumasawa. Sayo ultimately creates an imaginary friend come persona by the name of Shannon. Shannon watches over, consoles and nurtures Sayo, acting as her friend but also an ideal to aspire to, the competent and kind servant that everybody likes. Sayo also takes inspiration from the legend of Beatrice, using this as the base for another imaginary friend, a mischievous witch on whom she can blame mistakes she makes in her duties. This is where we begin to see Sayo's tendency to avoid confronting her difficulties directly. At the same time, as Sayo's self-esteem suffers, Beatrice represents a kind of power fantasy and escape. Eventually, Sayo chooses to become Beatrice, encasing her true self within this persona. Outwardly, she lives as Shannon, the good servant and young woman who fulfills the role expected of her. Beatrice becomes a space for the rougher edges and more childlike qualities Shannon's role doesn't allow for. In time, Sayo adjusts to this way of living, even developing feelings for Battler over the course of his visits to the island. bonding with him over their love for mystery fiction. This brings purpose to her life, with Battler also representing an escape and even a future beyond Rokkenjima. In a series of dream sequences, we see Beatrice try to beckon Shannon to join her in the Golden Land where she resides, essentially asking her to give up on her mortal desires and the pain they promise. Shannon argues that though her day-to-day life can be difficult and tiresome, it's also irreplaceably precious. This is Sayo's avoidant side battling it out with the her that recognises the worth of the feelings she has for Battler. This position is strengthened by Battler's apparent reciprocation. He promises to eventually take Sayo away on a white horse, which Sayo interprets as Battler confirming he intends to enter into a relationship with her in time. This hope sustains her through a long stretch of not seeing Battler, but things become more complicated when she finds out that he has suddenly left the family, following the death of his mother and the exposure of Rudolph's infidelity with Kyrie. Sayo interprets the event as a trial to test her devotion, believing Battler will return for her the following year on account of their promise. After 3 years of waiting, at the 1983 conference, Kyrie brings letters from Battler addressed to each of the cousins, but nothing for Sayo. Sayo is finally forced to confront the fact that Battler has forgotten her, and is bereft. When the pain becomes too much, she resolves to consign her feelings for Battler to her Beatrice persona, effectively attempting to repress them. As this goes on, Sayo also becomes aware that she isn't experiencing puberty as she expects to, with her period failing to arrive and her body remaining undeveloped. Her suffering self-image deepens her feelings of self-hatred, and she yet further compartmentalizes her identity, taking on a role as a younger male servant, Canon. Canon equally serves as an opportunity to express the increasingly negative emotions and qualities that would go against the image Sayo wishes to have as Shannon. Shannon and Canon each begin to develop their relationships with George and Jessica respectively. Around this time, Kinzo hangs the portrait of Beatrice complete with the epitaph, which Sayo goes on to solve. When she discovers the gold, Genji, Kumasawa and Nanjo also reveal her origins to her. During the war, while stationed at Rokkenjima, at the time a military base, Kinzo meets an Italian, Beatrice Castiglioni, and begins an affair. He later buys the island following the war, and hides Beatrice away in Kuadorian while continuing to live a normal life with his wife and children. Beatrice falls pregnant but dies in childbirth. Kinzo also names their daughter Beatrice. This is the Beatrice Rosa meets, and witnesses the death of. Before Beatrice's death, however, she also bears a child, after being raped by her father, who, in his grief, views her as her mother's reincarnation. This child is Sayo. Sayo is the baby Kinzo offers Natsuhi, who she subsequently pushes off the cliff with the servant carrying her. With Kinzo believing Sayo has died, Genji, Kumasawa and Nanjo take this opportunity to remove the baby to Fukuin House, hoping to eventually reveal the truth to both her and Kinzo, when they can trust that Kinzo can accept Sayo as her own person and not another substitute for Kinzo's dead lover. During the accident, Sayo's sexual organs are mutilated, the ostensible cause of her stunted development. Sayo is later brought into the family as a servant, and the adults support her to solve the epitaph, find the gold, and claim her rightful status as head of the family. Upon discovering the truth, Kinzo apologizes to Sayo and passes away the same night, seemingly having found peace, after long being tormented by guilt for his actions. Sayo is left in shock, having also now discovered that she is related to Battler, Jessica and George. Sayo requests that the events of the night are kept a secret and that she is allowed to continue as a servant for the time being. As she grapples with what to do, her relationships with George and Jessica continue to develop, with George eventually making clear that he intends to propose. Sayo suffers immensely under the stress of keeping the truth from them both, being torn between her relationships with each, and the realization that she likely won't be able to have children. This is why Sayo refers to herself as furniture. She is unable to love, physically and morally. Revealing the truth feels more and more impossible, and the guilt of concealing it becomes greater and greater. George sets the date of his proposal for the family conference of 1986, pushing Sayo to make her decision, and it's here that she discovers that Battler will return to the family 6 years after he left and forgot the promise he made to her. With no idea what to feel, this finally pushes Sayo over the edge, and she begins to plan a mass murder-suicide, all the while hoping somebody will solve the epitaph and stop her, as per her conditions. She leaves everything up to fate. Episode 2 is the first to explore Sayo's inner conflict, her right to her own feelings, her want to believe in the love she is shown, and her fear that were George and Jessica to know the truth, they would reject her. This conflict manifests perhaps most clearly in how Sayo discusses intimacy. There are multiple points where Beatrice mocks Shannon and Cannon's relationships, and states that true love cannot exist between a man and a woman, only lust. Sex frightens Sayo deeply. It is emblematic of her inadequacy, as well as of the trauma of her origins. Sayo's body is undesirable, underdeveloped, but these are things she can obscure, for example in her attempts to emulate Beatrice, who herself resembles the kind of woman Battler describes wanting, something impossibly far from her true self. What she can't change is her likely inability to have children, or sex, and meet what she believes are her partner's central desires, and the most base things expected from her as an adult woman. Sayo seeks refuge in her relationship with Maria, one that acts as a cocoon from this threat, and an opportunity to remain innocent and free from the pressures of maturation. Sayo also identifies with Maria as another unwanted and unloved child, somebody who equally sees herself as defective due to the circumstances around her birth. The label of the witch which both adopt is something Sayo initially finds refuge in, reclaiming her ostracization and finding power in playing this role. But this too is recontextualized with the truth. Sayo wants to meet the expectations placed upon her, wants to take her place in society, but feels she would surely be shut out. When hurt, Sayo retreats back into her relationship with Maria, into the unconditional and untainted love she alone offers, telling herself this is all she needs, though she knows this isn't true. Ultimately, Enja calls her out within the meta world for fostering a kind of codependency, encouraging Maria to likewise rely on her alone and completely reject her relationship with her mother. While Rosa is undoubtedly abusive, all this achieves is to underline and prolong Maria's trauma, rather than letting her forge her own path to happiness and fulfillment. At the beginning of episode 2 we explore a series of metaphors. As a fish, if you believe a tank in an aquarium is the sea, then it is. If you believe the grey sea is blue, it is. Perception becomes reality. You can choose happiness, but there's an alternative interpretation. If you accept that the limited world of the aquarium or the dullness of the grey sea is all that will ever be available to you, you will never know more. When Battler, Jessica and George show Sayo kindness and companionship she hasn't experienced from almost anybody else in her life, it's inevitable that this will have a strong impact on her. To Sayo, this is the only chance at love and companionship she has been able to conceive of, and that love is conditional. George's monologue in the proposal scene from episode 6 is particularly interesting for exploring the two's dynamic. George reflects on how he viewed women prior, stating that he worshipped and feared them simultaneously, and didn't have any female friends. He considered himself a gentleman, but this was exactly what created the distance. He believed that by being so, he was owed something in return, and became more and more bitter at the complete lack of interest he experienced. To George, women were a means of affirming his own masculinity. George ultimately confesses that his feelings were initially rooted in winning Shannon from and proving himself to Battler, another man. Sayo too, then, is trying to prove something to herself through George. Not unlike Natsuhi before her, the question isn't whether Sayo truly loves George. She undoubtedly cares for him deeply. But how far can this be untangled from what George represents? Sayo is significantly younger than George, of a different class, and simply unable to secure the life and prospects he offers her without him. Most of all, he is equally necessary in her self-affirmation as a woman. Ultimately, when Sayo discovers Battler is returning, she cannot bring herself to choose George, cannot choose the perfect life George represents over her true feelings. And yet, even the relationship Battler and Beatrice eventually foster in the meta world is far from a romantic ideal. In episode 6, when now Game Master Battler attempts to revive Beatrice following her death, he cannot accept what he ends up with. A conceptually infant Beatrice, before she became the person he knows her to be, who sees him now more as a father. There are overwhelming parallels to the relationship between Kinzo and his daughter Beatrice. Kinzo sees his daughter as the Beatrice he loves reborn. He forces a role and identity onto her and doesn't accept her for who she is, culminating in the rape. The scene when Battler's Beatrice first wakes up is uncanny, complete with Kumasawa tending to her in Kuwadorian as she did Kinzo's daughter. When Battler realises Beatrice is not the person he expected and wanted her to be, he takes his grief out on her in the form of anger. Really, this is Battler's anger at himself being misdirected. After all, his purpose in reviving Beatrice is to show her that he has finally come to understand her, to grant her wish and save her from her suffering. And he is being forced to confront the reality that he is too late. The parallel between Battler and Kinzo works on some levels, but is questionable on others. Kinzo and Beatrice Castiglione's romance is another that can be viewed from two angles. The story Kinzo himself recounts of the two falling for one another when she first arrives on Rokkenjima, and ultimately being the only ones to leave the island alive after the Japanese and Italian armies turn on one another, or the factual version, the much older Kinzo effectively kidnapping Beatrice, having her live as his mistress in confinement and isolation until she dies in childbirth. As usual, this isn't a question of fiction and truth, but the in-betweens. Beatrice may well have loved Kinzo, but did she have any choice, or any other way of viewing her set of circumstances? And how are we to know, when Kinzo controls the narrative? Battler resurrects Beatrice with the genuine intention of granting her peace, and arguably answers her wish to be understood and empathised with. But ultimately, his interpretation of how she feels is nothing more than this. Sayo is gone. Most of all, the happy ending Battler gives Beatrice equally serves to absolve him. The comparison feels egregious, but as it's one the story itself goes to such pains to illustrate, Battler's actions can be seen as akin to Kinzo's apology to Sayo, one she is in no position to accept, and yet is given no choice to respond to in any other way. In this moment, Sayo and the new Beatrice are vessels, facades projected onto, wanted and loved only as echoes of something they can never be. I've seen the argument that the themes explored through Sayo's character make the most sense, or only make sense at all, alongside the interpretation that she is born male and raised as a girl due to her accident. Though I don't personally subscribe to one view, I would disagree. Each of the characters I've discussed struggle with who they truly are and what they truly want, in the context of the roles they must perform. For Sayo, there is no hope of fulfilling this role at all. This is the aquarium that imprisons her. She too tries to find happiness, even to dream of what a future might look like, but comes up against the immovable fact of her sex. Male, female, or anything else, she is not what a woman is expected to be, and so she is worthless, unlovable, a disgrace. There is no place for her in a world defined by these facts. Umineko's women are unique but united in their pursuits of respect, autonomy, power, acceptance, companionship. The condition is conformity. When they can silence their voices, subdue their personalities, stifle their emotions, have their bodies perform at will, make themselves objects, but not just objects, perfect objects, desirable and fecund and nothing more, this is when they will become enough, become worthy. The woman our characters are expected to be is not a woman at all, but an idea, a fantasy. In the contortion required to reach this impossible place, somewhere, each loses their way. The ideal the story opts to show us is a kind of reprieve from this. In a world where Natsuhi accepts the baby, Beatrice is never born. Sayo never becomes a witch. In this world, Natsuhi welcomes the child she is expected to raise, doesn't receive this as an affront to her womanhood, or swallows such feelings. She actively chooses the role of the mother, as much as she ever had the option to, and seemingly goes on to find meaning and fulfillment in the genuine love she offers the child. She recognises that the baby is not itself at fault, and vows to love it as her own. She severs the chain. It's likely the same thing Asumu does for Battler. Thus, Dion is given the unconditional love and acceptance their mother was not. This gives them the confidence to go on to carve a space for themselves beyond the status quo, not inoculated from the world they exist within, but prepared to face it as they are. Finally, in episode 8, we see that after being shot by Kyrie, Sayo survives, and, in spite of it all, seeks the cousins out to save them. The only person she finds is Battler. Though she's dressed as Beatrice, he recognises her as Shannon, and demands an explanation as they escape. The bomb has been activated, and at midnight the island will be no more. She details her original plans to kill them all, and her guilt, despite it not being what came to pass. She brings them both to the old submarine dock her grandmother arrived at decades before, and shows Battler to a motorboat, but tells him that she mustn't go on. He tells her that he'll steal her away despite her protests. Battler shows her mercy, telling her that they can atone for her sins together. Still, once they're on the water, she has Battler close his eyes, kisses him, then jumps into the sea with a single gold ingot to carry her to the bottom. Earlier in the story, Battler compares Beatrice's mindset to that of Shion from Higurashi. Shion is somebody who, after horrendous mistreatment and ostracization, commits a series of murders while disguised as her twin sister, wanting more and more for somebody to realise and stop her, to condemn her, but most of all, see her. Shion believes her existence is a mistake, and so becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sayo equally decides that if she isn't worthy of love or happiness, she'll at least punish those who made that so, and become hateable instead. And yet all the while she questions what it is she truly wants, argues with herself, hopes for somebody to notice, to recognise her suffering and her loneliness and share that weight. Ultimately, she can never give up on her dream of being accepted, and so she is alive and dead, in purgatory, both resigned to and fighting what she believes is her fate. Umineko is, amongst many things, a story about longing to be known, and seeking to understand as an act of deep devotion. For a brief, glittering moment, Sayo and Battler achieve something close to this. They see and embrace one another, a dream beyond dreams. Sayo believes that this is it. Here, she has found happiness. She opts to preserve the beauty of that singular moment. She does not trust that when they reach land and Battler is confronted with the truth laid bare, the magic won't dissipate under its weight. She cannot conceive of Battler truly loving her. cannot stand to see through what she believes is a foregone conclusion, and so she jumps. Ultimately, Sayo alone does, in a sense, liberate herself. She takes back power in the most literal way she can. If the world will not accept her, she will reject it. In death alone, there is a kind of certainty that can be mistaken for peace. At the same time, she sacrifices another kind of liberation, that of the infinite possibilities of a future yet unobserved. Until the end, she drives through cycles of hope and fear. But for all of this, she wonders whether Battler will mourn for her if she dies, but doesn't want to imagine him eventually moving on to somebody else and forgetting her. This is one of the selfish wishes that drives her conception of the massacre. She both wants him and cannot bear to face everything that voicing these feelings would mean, and so finds a third solution that erases the problem, her avoidance taken to its most extreme conclusion. She will open the box. She will kill the cat with her own hands. Sayo is afraid to live because it necessitates suffering, loss, rejection and hardship, and yet true joy only exists in the context of these things, and companionship only in enduring them. Love is made in the spaces between, in doubting and belief, in seeing what isn't tangible. Two people can create a universe, not shunning all that is, but facing it to declare a new truth. And so we return to the sea. In this moment, the rest of the world is silent, and there is a hand outstretched. She wants to take it. She can't, and so she is, and always was, human.